I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and allow me to welcome you to Being and Logos, an introduction to Middle-Platonism. This seminar hopes to explore the philosophical foundations, especially in metaphysics, at the heart of Western philosophy following the death of Plato and before the rise of Plotinus in Neo-Platonism. But really importantly, this seminar is an example, an experiment really, in crowd-funded university-level education. No paywalls, no subscriptions, no fees, just here's a class for free. And that's only really possible through the generous support of my Patreon. If you want to support this project, please consider taking a look down below at the links for my Patreon. But otherwise, I'm honored to welcome you to this course as we explore the fascinating philosophical developments at the very heart, at the very origin of Christianity, of Hermeticism, of Gnosticism, and the foundations of Western Esotericism. Welcome to Being and Logos. All right, everyone. Welcome to the lecture that I didn't want to do because it's basically it's a course in the impossible. Philo, as you probably know, left behind a considerable amount of writing. This is his complete works and the standard English translation. It's about 900 pages worth of completely tedious writing that is just unpleasant to wade through. If you're curious what it looks like in the 16th century edition, this is a 16th century edition of Philo Philo and Opera. This is a big 16th century edition. You get some sense of the chunk malunk that is this book. It's printed in 1652. So you kind of get a sense of the scale of Philo. And I think I said last time that when we get to Philo, what's the shocking about him, and we'll talk more about this as we get toward the end of the lecture, is that we have, if you take everything that we've talked about up to this point, basically, and put it on the one side of a scale, and then take Philo probably outpaces them maybe by an order of 4 or something. So the problem now is that we go from there's just tiny fragments of things of Antiochus of Ascalon or Xenocrates to now we're drinking from a water hose. And so the problem with this lecture is how do you do with Philo, because there's so much, and on the one hand there's actually so little. So we're gonna get into Philo, and I hope to cover him in one go, and if we do, that's great, and if we don't, well, so it goes. But Philo, this is a famous woodcut of him from the 18th century. Philo of Alexandria is one of the only Middle Platonists whose works survive in a substantial amount. We have a pretty big grouping, as you just saw, of Philo's works thanks to early Christians, and so we have a sort of a massive amount of Philo's works. Unfortunately, Philo's just in some sense of all the philosophers that I wish we could have salvaged, it's not him actually. I wish I could have traded, sort of an exchange of what we get from history and what we don't. And of all the people that I wish we kind of lost was Philo, and all the kind of people I wish we preserved were people like Chrysippus. So unfortunately, we have a lot of Philo, and this is sort of we have to deal with him. But as I said, probably the reason why he survives at all is because he was adopted in some sense by Christians. People like Eusebius, the church historian, a couple centuries later, in some sense thought Philo was a kind of precursor to Christianity, and maybe even sort of anachronistically describing Christian communities. And they saw in Philo, because people like Clement of Alexandria and Origen are going to build Christian theology using a lot of Philonic language, that they saw in Philo the kind of project they were doing. And so this is part of the reason why Philo survives the filter of the 4th century in a way that, Antiochus of Ascalon just doesn't, because Christians don't need him. And it's not because they're actively, sometimes people think that ancient Christians were just actively seeking out and destroying books. They weren't doing that. They just weren't copying them. And so when you don't copy something for a couple of generation or two, the papyrus just degrades and falls apart. And that's exactly what's happened with a lot of these texts. They're not destroyed, they're just left behind, and what gets copied is what got preserved, and what got copied was Philo, because Philo represented the interests in some sense of those Christians. But we know surprisingly little about him, given the fact that we have so much of his writings. He was born sometime in around 20 or 15 before the Common Era, and he survives up until about 50 of the Common Era. So he's living sort of right during a time, for instance, when Jesus is alive. Philo and Jesus could have, he had to cross the Sinai, but they could have met. And if it's the case that Jesus' family really did flee to Egypt, which I'm not sure if I believe that story, They could have been living next door to Philo. Probably not, because they'd have been incredibly poor. And Philo was the brother of the richest man in all of Alexandria, which was itself a fantastically rich city. His brother was a tax collector, and so Philo was living in an incredibly wealthy family. For what we know, Philo didn't even have a job, which explains why he was able to write all this stuff. So what we have in Philo is an incredibly wealthy man, situated in one of the most educated cities in the world, and he represents a part of the Jewish community that existed in Alexandria. It's about 1 million souls, by the way, that lived in Egypt at the time. And so Philo represents, in some sense, that kind of Judaism, maybe. And I say maybe because Philo could have just been some weird guy, and it could have been just his own particular strange kind of Judaism, though we do have some evidence that, for instance, there are people that come before him, Aristobulus and Pseudo-Odysseus, who have similar kinds of allegorizing approaches to Judaism, but little of their work survives. But we do have ideas, for instance, of combining Plato and the Septuagint in Judaism a century or so earlier than Philo, a couple centuries earlier than Philo. So he could be part of a larger Alexandrian world of Hellenizing Judaism that really absorbs the Stoic method of allegory. And I say fantastically wealthy. I mean, he and his brother were able to donate massive amounts of gold and silver that were used to decorate the temple in Jerusalem. Although from what we can tell from his writings, he didn't really care about the temple in Jerusalem. It seems like he went there once exactly, which Jews are supposed to go there 3 times a year. It seems like he went once. I mean, Judea was a bit of a backwater compared to somewhere like Alexandria. And so it would have been the case that I can imagine he would have found it to be terribly inconvenient to have him to travel all the way over to Caesarea to go visit the Jerusalem temple. So on the one hand, he's really into his Judaism, especially in terms of its intellectual side, its wisdom side, but it's not clear to what degree he was observant of Judaism, it's not even clear what even being observant of Judaism even meant in a diasporic community at this time. So it's all very complicated and very poorly understood. But we do know that Philo was ultimately elected to represent the Jewish community after a series of riots, we might call them pogroms, that happened in 38 and 40. He had the great pleasure of having to go be a delegate to Caligula, of all people. You can imagine this guy, Philo, who seems like, a very strange individual in some ways, having to go talk to Caligula, of all people, about the recent turbulence in the city, which is a very complicated business that maybe we can get into. Has to do with Caligula installing statues of himself in synagogues, which was a big no-no, and also the imposition of one of the Agrippas into the city to deal with co-opt Flaccus, and it became a whole big problem. So at any rate, this led to huge pogroms in the city, and Philo was sent to Rome in his later years, probably in the 60s, in order to in treaty to Caligula to basically stop the rioting. So there's a lot going on with Philo. It doesn't seem like he knows Hebrew, which is an interesting fact about him, considering he does etymology at length. These etymologies, from what we can tell, are probably him actually just looking in handbooks of Hebrew, so he can probably read Hebrew letters, but it's not clear he has any actually working knowledge of Hebrew. And when he does deal with the Bible, he deals almost exclusively with the Septuagint translation. So he has very little traditional Jewish education. His education seems overwhelmingly Greek, and he's applying that very Greek education to the project of philosophizing Judaism as he understands it in the text. What's interesting also about Philo is he doesn't seem to know anything else. We don't see any good evidence of him knowing a lot of things outside the Septuagint. For instance, he could have easily read the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch was available to him. There was a Greek translation. He could have read it in Greek. And that's, of course, interesting because he wrote a whole book on the giants, or a short essay, rather. And he does have interest in this kind of material, but we never see him sort of reaching out of the Septuagint. He doesn't seem like he knows much about other kinds of Jewish traditions. And so, he's not terribly learned in traditional Judaism. It seems like primarily he's working in the Septuagint. But at the core of his program is the allegorizing of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and basically mining out of the Hebrew Bible proof that it is philosophically rigorous, that there is a deep philosophic undercurrent in the Septuagint. And what underwrites this is the same kind of ideas that we've seen in people like Eudorus, where Eudorus wants to have us convinced that all of philosophy since Plato and Aristotle really goes back to Pythagoras. And Pythagoras is really the authentic, true philosophy. This kind of Prisca philosophia idea. Well, what Philo continues to develop, that comes from people like Aristobulus, is the idea that actually, in fact, Pythagoras himself, and therefore all Greek philosophy, is actually downstream of Moses. That Moses is the original wise man, revealed things by God, and it is Moses that gives he's both a great legislator and he is the great philosophizer, and it is from Moses that all this wisdom streams down to Pythagoras. Now, there's all kinds of anachronistic stuff that has to go on to make that happen. You have to explain, where Moses is in the timeline, because obviously he can't be directly teaching Pythagoras because he's 600 years too early for that. So there's all kinds of questions about what's going on with this. But at any rate, it's the anything you can do, I can do better business that we've seen already with Eudorus, where they're just trying to kick the ball back into their own camp and say, it's our camp that represents ancient, authentic, true philosophy. And in this place, it is Philo doing it with Moses and Judaism. But what he does, interestingly enough, is he takes a Stoic allegorical method, and you can probably remember that there's a big problem with the myths. In the ancient Greek world, the myths present themselves as a problem because you can't dispense with them. Everyone takes them seriously as containing some kind of authentic truths. So the question is, what do you do with them? Because they seem to contain things that are morally outrageous, for instance. So one of the arguments that is made that what you do with the myths is you edit them. That's Plato's solution, that you edit them. Another solution that was brought on by the Stoics, and probably reaches far, it does in fact reach much further back than the Stoics. We see it with the Orphic hymns and things like the Derveni Papyrus, is the idea that you don't need to read them literally. What you need to do is they're actually allegories for natural processes, cosmic processes, and philosophical processes. And so the task then of the sage for the Stoics is to go to the myths and then mine out of them the correct allegorical interpretation. So that you shouldn't read Neptune, what you should read is water. You shouldn't read this, you should read that. So there is a kind of allegorizing of them in which you rescue them by allegorizing them. What's going to happen is that Philo is going to do the same thing to show that Judaism in the Septuagint contains an authentic, perhaps primordial philosophy that just so happens to look like, surprise, surprise, welcome to the world of Middle-Platonism, a kind of stoicized Plato. So he's going to be interpolating a lot of Stoicism, a lot of Platonism, a lot of Pythagoreanism, especially in his obsession with numerology, into the Septuagint. And so what we see there is that we can, now that presents us a problem. And the problem that it presents us is that Philo is completely inconsistent about how he does this. So I'll give you an example that we'll get to in a bit. When he sees 3 of something, talking about there are 3 of these things in the temple, he'll say, oh, that's the 3 levels of the soul. And then there'll be 7 of something over here, and you go, oh, that's the 7 levels of the soul. And you're like, which is it? Philo, is it 3 or 7 or 2 or what is it? And what he's doing is he's taking any instance he can to kind of tweak the philosophy out of it. And so if he sees something over there that kind of corresponds to Stoicism, he'll mine out some Stoicism. If he sees something over there that looks a bit like Pythagoreanism, he'll mine that out. And when you read his works, what you never see is an essay called, here is my Philo's idea about philosophy. Rather, what we have is just these long allegories. And we have to go through the allegories and go, okay, so there he seems to be stoicizing, here he seems to be Pythagoreanizing, but what is his actual coherent philosophy? I'm not sure he had one. I think that all he wants to do is show that in a very Gestalt sense, philosophy exists in the Hebrew Bible, roughly corresponding to the kind of philosophies that we've encountered already, and that is sufficient for him. And it doesn't really matter. He's not concerned with whether the soul is actually bipartite, tripartite, septipartite. What he's concerned about is inside of the Bible, there are these secret philosophical nuggets that he thinks that he can get out of the text. The other thing that makes Philo very tedious to read, or mystically magical, is his obsession with numerology. Philo will take any instance. I mean, as you know, if you've ever read the Bible, you know the Bible likes to number things. This is a very sort of Levitical impulse on the part of the Bible. There are 7 of this and 5 of this, and of that 5, there are 3 of this. That is an opportunity for Philo to double down on Pythagoreanizing numerology. And he'll say, look, if there are 7 of this, that represents completeness. And if we square 7, it's 14, and that represents the this amounts of that. And if we divide it by 4, we get this. And it just goes on and on and on with the numerology. And the numerologists will be fine if the numerology were, 1, consistent. If 7 always meant the same thing, if 7 always meant completeness or something like that, it would not be maddening. The problem is that 7 tends to mean 7 different things. And it just depends on what mood Philo is in about what exactly he's going to make it mean today. And maybe later on I can mine out some examples of this, but it just feels like you're locked into the room with a person who's pretty unhinged at some level, or just sort of obsessed with these very small things that, again, sort of make it difficult to follow his train of thought and make it basically impossible to mine out exactly what his position is. And I'll just give one example of this. Scholars still don't really understand, for instance, whether Philo thinks the world created, which is clearly created out of nothing, or if he accepts creation from eternality. And the reason why we don't know if he believes it is because he says both. Sometimes he interprets Plato this way, or the Bible this way. Sometimes he interprets it that way. For instance, we don't know exactly what his position on free will is. He seems to sometimes say, no, pronoia is the way the world is structured, and therefore that is all that there is. In other sections, he seems to be completely voluntarist about his belief in terms of free will. So, and again, it just depends on what the Bible is doing in that particular verse of Deuteronomy or Exodus or what have you. So this can be a bit maddening when it comes to studying Philo. But let's get into it. I'll be very honest. The version of Philo that I'm going to present is mostly following. It's going to be mostly following the textbook we're looking at. Although a little bit in the back of my head is also the famous study by Wolfson, which I have. That's the standard study. And the problem is that the Wolfson interpretation of Philo has been a bit abandoned and yet still remains the same study. What I'm saying is that the version I'm giving you could easily be contested by any Philo textbook you pick up. So if you go pick up any textbook of Copleston, of Wolfson or whatever, they're all hybridized versions of what Philo believed for this allegory business that I've already been mentioning. So the version I'm going to give you is me trying to show you the wealth of the many worlds that lived inside of Philo and try to mine out a bit about where he might land most consistently. But again, you go read his interpretation of Genesis, you're going to get one version of God. You read another text, you'll get another version of God. Philo's all over the place. But generally speaking, this is where Philo lands in terms of the divine. He tends to follow the Pythagoreans here. And he follows the Pythagoreans in that he posits a utterly transcendent God. This is a God for whom nothing can be known. This is a God for whom there are no true predicates. So we've already seen this sort of hyper ontologizing of God in other Pythagorean texts, and we've seen it, for instance, in Speusippus as well. He will refer to God as to ontos on, that which truly is, the only thing which truly is, the existent being. I know that sounds redundant, of course, because if there's a being, there must be existent. But there's 2 Greek words here that he can kick around, and so he really doubled down on the truly existent. He'll also refer to God as the monad in typical Pythagorean fashion, but also, again, things like the unnameable one, which is interesting because in other places where Philo reads the Bible and God clearly names God's self, Philo will say, well, yeah, that's God's name. God is to ontos. The I am that I am is just being, right? It's the one beyond being. So he calls him unnameable in some places and says, no, this is God's name. Because the Bible does that. The Bible is not terribly consistent either. Of course, it's also incomprehensible through any idea. So there is no adequate idea of the divine. And again, this is very typical Pythagorean language about sort of hyper-ontological condition of the divine. He has this very famous quote that even if the heavens could speak in one articulate voice, they would still not be able to name the one that is. So obviously, we're not going to be able to do it. If the entire cosmos could utter with one voice, they could also not name God as well, which is quite a beautiful image. And even the Logos, which we're going to get to in a bit, not even the Logos can attain to the divine. So even the firstborn divine Son, which is how Philo describes the Logos, the Stoic idea being imported into Philo's thinking, not even the Son, the divine Son, the firstborn divine Son of God could even attain to God as well. Now, this is a question about to what degree is this Pythagorean and to what degree is this Judean? Because Judaism also has a tendency toward negative theology. We know that that develops later in the rabbinical mind. There's a kind of idea that God is beyond all knowing. And so the question is this an idea that's just current in Judaism at this time? Or is this more of a Pythagorean line that Philo has taken? My sense is that this is much more of a Pythagorean thing than a specifically Jewish line, because what's happening in the rabbinical imagination at this time, again, you have to think about this is sort of around the time just after Hillel dies over in Judea and the Galilee. So it's around the time of the rise of the early Tanaim. And that time is also when they're developing the idea of the Shekhinah, the immanent presence of God in the world. And that kind of Shekhinah theology would be dominant among the rabbis. And so you do have a radical idea of the immanence of the divine in a way that we do not see in Philo with the radical, more Pythagorean transcendence of the divine. Now, this menorah is from the synagogue, the oldest surviving ruins of a synagogue in Europe, actually. This is from Ostia Antica, which you ever get the chance to go to Rome. Sometimes people check it all the way over to Pompeii, but if you want just a day trip and go to the beach as well, Ostia Antica preserves some of the best apartment buildings in ancient Rome as well. Needless to say, Philo is inconsistent about the nature of whether or not matter is primordial or created. Again, this is a popular debate that we have in this time period in Middle-Platonism. But typically the way he likes to talk is stoically about this. So now we're shifting gears from first gear Pythagoreanism to second gear Stoicism. We go over to the idea of God as a kind of an active principle, of which matter is a passive principle, and that the impact of the active principle onto the passive principle, which is always happening in the Stoic imagination, is kind of what generates reality as we know it, until, of course, it undergoes the cycle of being purified by fire, and everything is destroyed in the process of ekporosis. So that tends to be the way that Philo talks, is in a much more Stoic way. But we also know that the reason that's militating this for Philo is that Philo is very interested in, again, the very Stoic concept of pronoia. He likes the idea that God has a providential relationship with reality, in that God reveals God's self in that providential relationship with reality. And the main way that Philo is interested in the way that God reveals God's self is through the revelation of the law, in specifically the ritual laws, we call sometimes the special laws, but also natural law. And so that also, the very Stoic way of thinking about God as a kind of, the Logos is a kind of divine lawgiver, of which nature is an expression of that law, and we are to align ourselves with the will of the divine, the will of the Logos, through following the natural law. What's interesting also is that he seems to interpret the two Genesis creation stories, which is interesting because most apologists in ancient times and in modern times want to say that there's actually just one creation story in Genesis. Philo clearly recognizes that there are two, and he says what they're describing actually is not the creation of two things. In fact, they're actually the development of two different realms of reality. The first realm of reality, of course, is the realm of the intelligibles. And so that's the first creation story. So what you're reading in the Genesis 1 creation story is the creation of the world of the intelligibles. And of course, with Adam being made out of clay, and Eve, Chava, being made out of the side of Adam, out of the rib of Adam, that is describing the world of the sensibles. And that gives us our two worlds that we typically like in Middle Platonism, the unchanging world of the intelligibles and the changing world of the sensibles. So we have that as an allegory being mined out of the two Genesis creation stories. And for the first time, we give a very clear declaration that the forms are to be placed in the mind of God. Now, this is an idea that becomes orthodox in Middle-Platonism. You're going to see this idea all the way through the Middle Ages. You're going to see it all the way down through now in some ways. There are still people out there who think about the idea that God thinks a sort of archetypical structure of reality, and that God's all these structures are in fact in the mind of. This idea we find directly in Philo. Now, as I mentioned last time, it seems like Eudorus believed this as well. So it may have been current in Philo's time, but because we actually have Philo, right, we actually have the book, we can see that Philo explicitly says this. And this is the first time where the idea that the thoughts of God are in fact the forms. Now, this creates a problem. Again, Philo doesn't seem to explore this for whatever reason, but if God is so radically transcendent, how do the forms get down here? Right? How does the forms get impressed into matter? And typically the way that Philo solves this is through the logos. This is an interesting Greek manuscript that we can see, a papyrus manuscript. It's just worth noting here that we have a manuscript of the Septuagint, but you can notice that the Tetragrammaton is still being written out in Hebrew. That's not always the case. It will sometimes be written out as Kyrios or Basileos, Lord or King, but most typically Kyrios. But here we have it still being written out in Hebrew. So it's interesting that we have it still here in Ashuri script. So to fix this problem, as much as anyone can fix this problem, the divine transcendence problem, is that Philo does what everybody does at this time period, and now is he introduces an intermediate being. Now, as we'll see, we're going to get a lot of intermediate beings, so buckle up for that. But the core intermediate being that Philo introduces to solve this problem is the Logos, who Philo associates with the angel of the Lord. So if you've ever seen anytime the angel of the Lord shows up in the Bible, that is for Philo the Logos, and a very Stoic Logos at that. This is the divine rational ordering principle of the cosmos. So straight Stoicism, but in some sense personified. So this is the immanent form of God in the world, which Philo refers to as the firstborn son of God. I'm sure you're beginning to hear why Christians like this, right? Philo comes to this position, and I can imagine Clement of Alexandria being like, I'll take one of those, thank you. So this is clearly the place where early Christians, Clement and Origen, are going to Philo, and it is just like a full-blown philosophical buffet to build out their high Christology, and this is perhaps the cornerstone of the kind of Christology. So what Philo believes happens, using classic Stoic ideas here, is that from the divine mind, the Logos inherits the forms, not as the forms in the divine mind, but as the Logos spermatikoi, as the seeds of Logos. I mean, it's so hard to translate this word, but as these kind of like seeds of these the divine mind as the forms. So those forms trickle down into the Logos. They become the Logos spermatikoi, and it is from those Logos spermatikoi, as imposed upon substance, right, ousia, that individuates matter and creates individual things. Now notice this is combining two things which really don't go together. It's combining the Platonic ideas of the forms in a very sort of Timaeus, craftsman, demiurge kind of way, but he's also using a bit of the ideas from Antiochus of Ascalon, where he needs to get the forms out of the divine mind and into matter. And how does he do that? He does it through the Logos spermatikoi. So this is a pretty clever, again, squaring of the circle between Platonism and Stoicism by introducing the Logos, detached from Orthodox Stoicism, making it the active principle of creation. In fact, Philo refers to the Logos as the organon, as the instrument of the divine, as the tool by which the divine ultimately works in the world. So the Logos is the means and the agent by which creation comes into being. And so, as we'll see, when God says, let us create, there is a party there. There's a bunch of entities there. And that us in the Genesis creation story is going to be the kind of entities starting with the Logos. So here, Platonism and Stoicism are kissing cousins. The logos is the demiurge, and that mechanism is going to become central to Middle Platonism. The logos is the demiurge, and that combining of these two things is core to the rest of Middle Platonism. In fact, I would say that it is core not just to Middle Platonism, it is core to Christianity. This is, again, you cannot read those first 18 verses of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. It is through the Logos in the Gospel of John that all things come to be. And in this way, the Logos is the organon, again, to use the Philonic language, is the instrument by which creation comes to be. So definitely cannot overstate the degree to which Philo is extremely important in this. In fact, I wish there were just a reader of Philo that just mined out all of his Logos talk, because I feel like especially for folks who are Christians, this would be an incredibly useful resource just to be able to go through and say, look, this is how this Logos stuff got developed in Philo, and this is how it's going to be picked up in Clement and Origen and Eusebius and other people as well. Now, there is an alternative interpretation of this, is that there's a question about which direction the influence is going. Is Philo influencing Chokhmah speculations that are going on in Judaism? So with the idea of Chokhmah, wisdom, as an incarnate hypostasis of God, and therefore this hypostasis sometimes is translated as the Memra in Aramaic. The Memra is the word, literally the word. And so the question is it Greek influencing Aramaic and rabbinical literature, or is it rabbinical literature and Aramaic influencing the Greek? My sense is that it's the Greek influencing the Aramaic literature, although there is a kind of parallel intellectual development happening both in Middle Platonism and in rabbinical thought. But my guess is that it is just because of the cultural dominance of Hellenism that the influence is being translated into Aramaic and rabbinical wisdom, and not the other way around, or rather they have independently come to similar conclusions, and they have sort of independently worked this way out on their own. But I don't think that it is the rabbis influencing or Jewish thinkers influencing Philo. I think this is a completely indigenously Hellenistic way of interpreting these texts. But we get more entities. This is what is also very interesting in Philo, is that Philo introduces the concept of the dunamis, the powers. So and again, this is tracking to the biblical understanding of angels. So Philo, in some sense, goes to the Bible, sees that there are all these intermediate entities like angels, and makes the argument that these sub-beings are, in fact, philosophical concepts. And these powers are further manifestations of the divine in reality, and they are the mechanism by which reality comes to be and is subsequently ruled. Now, the question is, how does all this relate to the Logos? Well, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the Logos isn't even in the picture. He talks about the powers independent of the Logos. Sometimes the Logos gives rise to the powers. It just depends on which text that you're reading. So of the powers, the two powers that are most consistently talked about in the text, we'll come to some more in just a minute, are goodness. This is the power of God. This is God's creative power. This is how God creates the world. And sovereignty. Sovereignty is the other power, and this is the mechanism by which God rules the world. This is God's regal power. So this is the idea that God can create the world and that God can rule the world, and these are hypostasized as specific powers that continue to exist in some form. And Philo, interestingly enough, posits that these are actually in the Bible, specifically when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, that the cherubim that kicked them out are, in fact, two cherubim. So it is interesting that the text does say plural, but there are two of them, and it is God's goodness and it is God's sovereignty that kicks Adam and Eve out. And these two cherubim also, of course, famously have the rotating sword of fire, and the rotating sword of fire is the Logos. The Logos is the rotating sword of fire. And again, you can imagine an early Christian reading this text and being like, There we go. I see, right? There's God's goodness. Maybe that's the Holy Spirit or something. There's a logos, obviously, in the middle, and then there's maybe God, the Father, who's the sovereignty. Again, it just depends on how you want to map this stuff on, but you begin to see these triads and these trinities, and you begin to think, this is the kind of stuff that, again, someone like Clement is going to be more than happy to extricate from Philo in order to build up their Christology. But as I said, the relationship to the powers and the logos is extremely obscure. I'm going to build a version out that I think is maybe a comprehensive approach to thinking about the powers. And I'm going to tell you that what I'm going to tell you is a completely constructed thing that I've made. If you go read Philo himself, he says this maybe once in his discussion on the Ark of the Covenant, but in other places, the discussion's all over the place. But in the case of, again, taking our good Pythagorean ideas, our graphodogmata ideas of the one and the indefinite dyad, right? That's three, right? The one and the indefinite dyad, right? So what do we get? We get a trinity, and of course, that is the logos, the goodness, and the sovereignty of the divine. Then what comes along? Another power. This is, of course, the power of Sophia, wisdom. So God's wisdom also becomes hypostasized in some of these texts, and the Sophia is said to give birth to the logos. So now we have a divine feminine, we have heavenly mother, so we have something for the LDS folks too in the crowd. Everybody gets something from Philo. So we have Sophia, who seems to now be an intermediary between the transcendent God and the logos. And so Sophia somehow gives birth to the logos. Again, is this consistent? No, but this is the kind of way that he talks. So the schema that I've developed that Philo will make me a liar anytime you go read him looks something like this. The divine and Sophia are sort of like heavenly father and heavenly mother, and they generate logos. Because logos has to come from somewhere, right? So logos is developed from there. And of course, it's very, Philo is a rabid misogynist. If you ever go read him, he had just some of the worst things to say about women. But at any rate, very heterosexual. They give rise to logos. Logos generates the other two subpowers of the creative and the regal. So these are the two powers I just mentioned a moment ago. From the creative comes another power called the merciful. Again, that's a rabbinical idea that we would see develop big time in the Jewish imagination, the idea of the 13 attributes of mercy. So this could be equally Jewish and equally Philo Hellenizing. And then from the regal generates two other subpowers called the legislative and the punitive, or sometimes called the forbidding. And those last two powers, by the way, are actually just Stoic stuff. The Stoics say the logos operates in the universe through legislating and through punishing. So when you do something against nature, nature punishes you, right? When you, I don't know, jump out of a second-story building and break your legs, you're not by nature, you can't fly. So nature teaches you a lesson about your inability to fly and jumping out of windows. So this is actually just coming straight over from Stoicism. So what we have are some, again, triadic structures, and then those structures giving rise to other kinds of entities, and ultimately it cashes out in the Stoic idea of the regal, the legislative, and the punitive. Philo says that these five, again, and it depends on how you want to count them, 5 or 7, these are the 5 entities that are actually the entities of the ark. So the ark is the logos, and I'm going to get them all wrong. The ark is the logos, and inside the logos are the broken tablets of Moses. There's a jar of manna, and there is the rod of Aaron that sprouted. And somehow again, Philo in his torturous method goes to great lengths to say, yeah, the logos houses all this, and inside of it are this many shards of the law, and this one represents this, and he goes through all this very torturous stuff to tell you how the jar of manna represents God's mercy, and et cetera, et cetera. So again, go read it if you want to, but this is the kind of thing that's very typical for Philo. Philo says there are 5 things in the Ark of the Covenant, including are the 5 things in the Ark of the Covenant, and they need to correspond to something. What do they correspond to? The metaphysical powers that make up existence. Trust me, it goes on like that for 900 pages with this stuff. Also, there are the 5 of these that represent the 5 cities of refuge, which, if you know your Hebrew Bible, you'll know that if you accidentally kill a person, you can retreat to one of the cities of refuge to avoid being murdered. And so the 5 cities of refuge represent these 5 powers as well. So again, anytime the Bible numbers something, Philo finds a way to shove ontology into the numbers and vice versa. This is also the us, when God says in Genesis, let us make man in our image and likeness. The us, right, is the powers, the 5 powers. Now again, how do you count them? Does that look like 5 to you? It doesn't really look like 5 to me. I think again, it depends on it depends on what you mean by 5. Anyway, this is one of our earliest depictions of the Ark of the Covenant. This is from the Ark of the Covenant as depicted at Dura Europa. And so you can see sort of a depiction of it there. I do like the fact that these are Philistines. This is when the Ark of the Covenant is stolen by the Philistines and gives them all hemorrhoids. And that's all I like the Philistines like being like dudes in pink togas. Somehow that just like the best Philistines ever are the pink toga Philistines. But anyway, this is when they steal the Ark of the Covenant and it gives them all hemorrhoids. I do like the fact that we have all this like mythology built up around the Ark of the Covenant about how it's the most dangerous, powerful alien technology ever built, and the Nazis tried to get it, and Indiana Jones, but like it did kill a guy when they touched it, but the most it ever did was give Philistines a bunch of hemorrhoids, which is just great. I don't know why that story is not told more and made into TV shows. The universe for Pythagoras, 3-tiered. As you can suspect, we love triplets. We love triplets in Pythagoreanism. Also, we kind of get a triple-tiered universe in the Hebrew Bible as well. If you think about Sheol being the lower world, our world being the overworld. Is that the overworld? Is that Final Fantasy thing? Yeah, it's the overworld, and there's sort of the firmament above us that holds back all the water, which is in the heavens. So this triple-tiered universe is pretty copacetic from both Middle-Platonism and the Hebrew Bible, although the triple-tiered universe, and you know what I'm going to say, that they don't talk to each other. Philo makes them talk to each other. So what he says, right, is that the world above the firmament, the world of the firmament is the world of the intelligibles. Our world down here, right, then 1 tier down is the world of the celestials. So this is this sort of ethereal world. Now, this is, again, the big debate in philosophy at this time. Physics specifically is the upper world made of a fundamentally different substance than the lower world? For the Aristotelians, they say, yes, the upper world is made of a kind of unending ether, the quintessence. And the Stoics say, no, it's all fire. It's just a very rarefied fire. What Philo does is split the difference and say the aether is just fire. So he just says the aether is just purified fire, and so it is sort of ethereal and Puranic, and that's the realm of the celestials. And of course, the sublunar world, the world of the sensibles, is our world, and that's the world composed of the 4 elements. And of course, anytime things are listed in groups of 4, Philo goes crazy, showing how this is semi-representative of the various elements. He also thinks that these are causally related, so the highest realm is directly caused by God. Now, how, again, an utterly transcendent God causes the highest realm isn't clear, but again, this is sort of when he says, let there be light, that is the world of the intelligibles. And of course, how does Philo do that? He knows that in the Republic, that the forms are compared to the sun, and what gives light but the sun. So this is sort of the super celestial sun that is the realm of the intelligibles. So that realm, then below that, the creative force, the creative power is responsible for the celestial realm, and the regal power, of course, is responsible for the sublunar realm in which we exist. And Philo says that all of the various realms, all the elemental realms, contain entities. We are a combination of all 4 elements, but there are also entities that are just earth. There are entities that are just water. There are entities, or rather entities that come out of water and are kind of watery, because obviously the sea is full of life. And there are also, of course, aerial beings, and including aerial beings like birds, but also aerial beings that live, that are pure souls that live in the sublunar realm. And this establishes his demonology, which we'll get to in just a bit. We'll come back to it in just a moment. He also thinks that there are fire-based entities, but he says that there are not many of those left, and they all live in Macedonia. So Go visit Macedonia and let me know if you see any specifically fire-related beings. I'm not kidding. He does say that there are not many of them left, and they all live in Macedonia. Salamanders, I suppose. I don't know. Philo's demonology is, of course, again built on the back of the angels of the Hebrew Bible and the young gods of Timaeus 41 and following. And he combines them to say that the young gods of the Timaeus are, in fact, the angels. But the angels are not just angels in the sense of messengers, but they are sublunar beings made of the ether that lives up between us and the moon. Some of these get incarnated. I don't know what they get incarnated into. My guess is something like heroes, that they might get incarnated into something like heroes. So it's maybe something like Goliath or other kind of supernaturally powerful beings are sort of embodied versions of these sort of souls that exist up there. And some of them are good and some of them are evil. So we have good daemones and bad daemones that live in the sublunar realm. And again, that's coming directly over from the epinomis, and that demonology is going to be typical of Middle-Platonism and just typical of everything all the way up to Catholicism. Obviously, being Jewish, you're not going to be allowed to worship these entities, so Philo is very much opposed to worshiping them. Interestingly enough, he says that the people who introduced worship of the celestial entities are the Chaldeans. Everyone blames the Chaldeans for all the bad stuff about astrology, but we also have a warning in rabbinical literature, right, not to seek out the Chaldeans. And this is a phrase still used in Judaism today about consulting astrologers, although lots of Jews did astrology. So very mixed bag about what to do with it comes to these entities that live in the heavens. This is, of course, you're seeing this image on the screen is the Antikythera device, which was a sort of ancient computer for doing celestial calculations. We think people have reconstructed it, and they think it's kind of an analog computer for predicting upcoming the position of celestial bodies, which is a really fascinating device. Also, the angels and the daemones that live in the sublunar realm are also the us too. When God created everything, again, Philo just any chance you get. But like I said, some of these are good and some of these are evil, and so there are good daemones and bad daemones, and they're partially posited actually to protect for divine goodness. So what Philo means by that is that bad things happen in the world, and natural disasters happen. There's earthquakes and bad things happen. God doesn't cause any of those. God is transcendently good. So what happens are the daemones, bad daemones, come down and they cause things like sickness. They cause things like natural disasters. They cause evil things to happen in the world. So God isn't responsible for any of the bad. God created a perfectly good universe. But the evil daemones, we're not told where these evil daemones come from or why they're up there or why they come down here and bother us. But they do come down and they do cause all kinds of ruckus down here. And Philo blames them on what we might call natural evil. We'll come back in a minute, talk about our free will, because I will explain moral evil, again, also not responsible for God. He also sometimes will say, and we'll get into his psychology just now, that inside of every human being, there's actually a split in our soul between a good soul and a bad soul. And again, this might be related to the rabbinical idea of the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov, the good inclination and the bad inclination. But it doesn't really track to typical Hellenistic psychology. So maybe this is, again, a place where some kind of rabbinical stuff is getting over to him in Alexandria. It's not clear. But his psychology is a mess, right? His psychology is a complete mess. He wavers between basically three positions, depending, again, on when the Bible says things. So as you probably know, the Bible loves to do things in sevens. So surprise, surprise, as we've talked about before, Stoicism has a unified theory of the soul divided into 7 faculties, right? You have the 5 senses, and you have the faculty of speech and the faculty of copulation. The Stoics talk about 7 faculties of a unified soul. Anytime 7 shows up, Philo jumps on that theory of his psychology. Sometimes things happen in 2s, or people have to decide between 2 things in the Bible. So what does Philo do? He jumps on the more sort of bipartite theory, where you have the rational soul and the irrational soul. The irrational soul represented by the senses,
and the rational soul represented by the logisticon or the hegemonicon, depending on, again, how Philo is feeling that day. We want to use more Stoic language or more Aristotelian language. And the idea is that the soul is governed over by the logisticon or the hegemonicon, and that, again, is sort of driving the five senses. And other times, the Bible sometimes likes to divide things into threes. So then Plato, or Philo rather, can do the purely Platonic theory that we know from the Platonic dialogues, where we have the image of the rational as the logisticon, and the thumatic, the spirited, and the nutritive part of the soul as well. And again, this is the famous image of the charioteer guiding the horses in order to pull the chariot properly, an image long coming from Plato. So which is Philo's position? It just depends on the day of the week, it seems like. Sometimes he likes the Stoic unified soul of 7 parts. Sometimes he likes to divide it into 3. Sometimes he likes a bipartite division. It just depends on which text you're reading. Philo's all over the place when it comes to his psychology. He also seems to believe in he likes the idea of a double creation or double soul. When I say double creation, he thinks of the human being as being created twice. There is a kind of celestial version of us. That is our ideal self. Our soul is created in the heavenly realm, and our soul somehow combined with our earthly form, our material form. So our material form is created, our soul is created, and they're smushed together. And this idea of double creation is, I think, shows up for one of the first times in Philo, but that idea is going to have huge ramifications when it comes to things like Gnosticism and even things like Kabbalah, where in Neo-Platonic versions of this, you're going to have a sort of super celestial version of human beings like Adam Kadmon or something, and then this other lower development of the self as well. And also you have the idea sometimes of a rational soul and a vital soul. The vital soul is simply what makes you alive. That part of you will die eventually, obviously, but the rational part of your soul, which is directly created by God and made in the image of God, that will not die. And Philo is interesting in that, unlike the Stoics, he does allow for the survival of the rational soul or the survival of the higher soul in the afterlife. So it does seem like he allows for it if you are what he calls the worthy. So it seems like evil people simply are annihilated at death. They don't survive, or if they do survive, perhaps they survive in some kind of ghostly form, which, as you may know, is typical of Plato. But he does allow for at least the rational, the worthy, to survive their death and to go on to some kind of afterlife. And again, if you go to Judaism at this time, this is Second Temple period Judaism, there's not agreement among Jews about the afterlife. Pharisees believe in an afterlife. Sadducees reject the idea of the afterlife. The Essenes are basically waiting for the world to end. They think it's going to come to an end pretty quick. So they're not really that worried about it at all. There's all kinds of ideas of physical transformation, angelification. These all ideas are all floating around in Judaism. To this day in Judaism, there's no agreement about afterlife. And so we shouldn't be terribly surprised to find that Philo sort of just like, picks a position and goes with it. It is also interesting, 2 things about Philo's psychology that I guess I'll mention while I'm still here, is that Philo believes that our world is Hades. This is an idea that seems to come from Pythagoreanism, that all the world below the moon is actually Hades, and that we are kind of living in Hades now, and therefore there's nowhere else to go. But when you die, that's just it. Your soul is just destroyed. But that this realm is a kind of Hades. This is a Pythagorean idea, and Philo seems to lean into it, which is interesting. And also the idea that the world is sort of ruled over by a lower kind of entity, a lower kind of rule-giving God, right? So the God that rules over this world is a legislative deity that seems to be primarily about legislation and punishing people. And of course, that's an idea easily derivable from the Hebrew Bible. That idea of the world being ruled over by a kind of legislative punishing entity is, I think, an idea that might be sort of prefiguring some of the stuff that's going to go into Stoicism, Gnosticism, specifically Sethianism, vis-a-vis sort of the bad demiurge, right? So there might be a kind of proto-Marcionite kind of position that could be mined out of Philo as well. So we have some interesting things in terms of Philo's idea of his psychology and how we get created and what our ultimate destiny is when it comes to that material. Philo wavers inconsistently between whether he is committed to Stoic determinism, and the reason why he likes Stoic determinism is because you get pronoia out of the deal. He loves the idea that the world is structured by the divine in such a way as to be in our best interest and to be in for our providence. A providence is thing guiding the universe. And he wastes no opportunity to throw shade at the Epicureans, who he thinks that the gods have basically, in his view of the Epicureans, the gods are just sort of out there partying in the intermundia, and the world's just random chaos. He hates that idea, and therefore he loves the idea of pronoia. So the problem with pronoia is that it seems to violate the idea of ethical volunteerism. Judaism is a religion in which you are commanded to do a bunch of rules, and you accrue virtue by having done those rules, and you're given things if you do them. You're given land, you're given prosperity, you're given certain kinds of things in the covenantal theology, and if you don't do them, you get punished. If it's the case that you have no choice in the matter, then the entire system seems completely redundant. Why give people a bunch of rules if you've already programmed them to follow them to some degree or not? And then punish them when they do exactly what you programmed them to do. Everybody knows this problem of predetermination. So Philo wavers wildly inconsistency. So sometimes he seems to be very much on the Platonic position of ethical volunteerism. That's Plato. Other times he really likes the idea of pronoia, and it seems like pronoia wins the day. How does Philo split the difference? He splits the difference, as much as this is possible, by making the argument that when we follow nature, when we follow pronoia, when we are actually doing providence, we are not, in that sense, free. We have joined our will with providence, and because we've joined our will with providence, there's no reason to talk about will anymore. Will is when providence presents us with what we should do, and then we do something else. Providence presents you with, here is, one glass of wine, but you drink a whole amphora, right? You've gone against nature, you've gone too much in one direction, and when you will to do bad things, you are free to will other than nature, and that is where free will comes in, and that's how he justifies moral evil. So in some sense, the only time that you're willing as an individual in a volunteeristic kind of way is when you're in violation of the natural order of things. And so free will is his way of describing moral evil. So evil daemones are responsible for what we might call natural evil. In our wills, when I will as Justin, and I will as Justin alone, and I don't will as Justin as led by providence, by pronoia, when I will as Justin alone, and in that moment of willing, I am free. Nature is going to punish me for it, of course, but I'm free, and freedom then just is the actual avenue of explaining what moral evil is. So this is an interesting way, again, of trying to square the circle between keeping pronoia on the one hand, and then also explaining why it appears that I can choose to do things at all, and specifically the idea of free will and what free will represents to Philo. So it is an interesting kind of thing that again, it's an interesting solution to this problem. In fact, he uses the language of logos sort of plucking us like strings. That when we are following logos, it's like we're in tune. Sometimes we even use that language, I guess, too. We're in tune with things, and that when we're in tune with things, we are following along with the sort of sound of music, the sound of providence. But it's when we're out of tune, right? When we're not in tune with nature, or we're not in tune with the logos, then we do all kinds of bad things. And so he likes the language of us being out of tune, and specifically out of tune with nature. And of course, that's that tonal language, right? That's Stoicism. And again, so it's sort of like, again, it's this tonal language of tuning or frequency that the Stoics have adopted, that we've talked about previously. So again, that's the kind of way that he wants to talk about this material. On the language side of things, I'm going to mention this just very briefly, just because I think that it's quite interesting. But I think it's interesting, but we'll mention it just briefly. On the language side of things, what he has is that he's introduced the idea of language from the Cratylus. So we know that Plato had an anti-conventionalist theory of language. He thought language was natural. And Chrysippus borrowed this idea that language was natural as well. For instance, he said that when you say the word ego in Greek, ego, your chin drops down to your heart. You're literally like pointing to the thing that you truly are. The Stoics believe that our heart was the center of our being. So when I say ego eimi, like I am, my jaw drops down, ego. It drops down to my heart, and that shows that literally the word ego is pointing physically to the thing that I am. So Chrysippus and Plato and other people held a very naturalistic theory of language. And the Pythagoreans had argued that, and of course, Aristotle did not believe this. Aristotle, there was all convention and sometimes onomatopoeia, but at any rate, the Pythagoreans doubled down on this, right? Or rather, maybe we could say that the Platonists and the Stoics doubled down on Pythagoreanism. The Pythagoreans, surprise, surprised, what are they going to say? They're going to say that language is fundamentally mathematical. There's a reason why there is a logic to language, and they take the Greek language as being an example of this. The language conjugates, language declines. There is a rational reason why you want to, if you want to talk in the aorist or put something in the subjunctive, there is a mode of being that is contrary to fact. And if you want to talk in the way that is contrary to fact, you might put something in the aorist or the subjunctive. And so the aorist and subjunctive, they conjugate. There are rules, there's logic, there's a kind of mathematicalness to language. And if you've ever studied Greek, you've been tortured by this, right? Or Latin or any inflected language, especially Sanskrit. My God, if you've ever had to suffer through Sunday rules, you begin to believe that the person who made this language is in fact the devil. So what we have in this business is that language is fundamentally rational. But there's a problem. If you have to claim that if the language is rational, where did that rationality come from? And what the Greeks never do is they never make the move to say that Greek was the primordial language. They say that Greek is maybe the best language, but they don't claim that it's the primordial language. In fact, they tend to even think that sometimes that the hieroglyphics down in Egypt were somehow a more ancient language, and they have good reason to believe that. Philo comes in and says, I got you. God spoke creation into being. God spoke Hebrew, taught that Hebrew to Adam. Adam, being one person, named everything in reality, right? Because you just imagine what would happen if everybody you know had to invent a language. We would invent a Wittgensteinian nightmare. We would invent private languages. And the idea is that because there was one person involved in creating language, or really disseminating language, that's the reason why there are any languages at all. All languages for Philo are downstream of this primitive Adamic language, which was probably Hebrew, and every language is a corruption of that. Now, what does this allow Philo to do? It allows Philo to torture us with fake etymology after fake etymology after fake etymology. There's nothing that makes my linguistic brain scream louder and want to throw this book across the room is that when Philo will tell you that Leah's name means this in Greek and this in Hebrew. He will derive all kind of completely bizarre etymologies because he believes that you can do etymologies in any language because ultimately they're all downstream of the original Adamical language. It makes you crazy. If folk etymologies make you crazy, maybe some folks find them like clever and funny, but he goes on at length at every word he can of any substance, and he will give you three different etymologies, because he thinks you can do this in Greek and Hebrew equally, because the Greek is derivative of the Hebrew, and this goes on and on and on. So this is interesting, right? Why there are languages at all? Because if originally for Philo there were many different people, they would have been many different languages. And they would never, I'm not going to speak the same, I'm not going to invent the same language as you unless you beat me over the head, of course. So the idea is for there to be language at all, it had to have been just one language originally. And it's all downstream of the Adamical language. And of course, that Adamical language is perfect because it literally tracks to the metaphysical reality of that entity. And I don't have to tell anyone watching this that that's going to have a huge impact on the development of Western Esotericism, because how much of Western Esotericism is out there looking for primeval systems, primeval languages, Adamical languages, Enochian languages, etc., etc. This is a huge idea in Western esotericism, and at least one expression of it is to be found in Philo. I'm sure it was current in Philo's day. I'm sure that Philo didn't invent it, but we do have it expressed in this way for the first time with Philo. This is a nice bilingual Greek inscription with a Hebrew inscription here as well. So this is a synagogue dedication in Greek and in Hebrew. It's a shalom. On the ethics side of things, Philo is going to again try to square the circle of Greek ethics writ large, sort of a combined Greek ethics that's all kind of Stoicism and everything else. He's going to combine them with biblical precepts and make the argument, again, in a very classical Platonic way, that acclamation to God, familiarization with God, making oneself like God is the task of ethics. Of course, God being transcendent, how do you do that? Well, you do that through the revelation of the law. The law has been revealed in the form of the Torah, and you acclimate yourself to the Torah. If you've ever found people who try to make up rules why on the seventh day you should rest, or why you can't have clothes of linen and wool, or people who try to make up ideas about why these commandments are the way they are, Philo does that as well. These are entertaining. But what we have in this, right, is a combination of the Torah and Greek law, or Greek natural law theory, and other kinds of theories being welded together. And because the revealer, because God is the Logos, the demiurge is the Logos for Philo, this is going to mean that we can combine this Platonic and Stoic idea, which we've already seen with Antiochus of Ascalon. If it is the case that nature, that the active principle of nature, the conscious principle of nature, is the Logos, then living in accordance to nature is just living in accordance to the Logos. So he gets to have his cake and eat it too when it comes to Stoicism and Platonism. Although he seems to be on team Stoicism when it comes to apatheia, which is to say he likes the idea of extinguishing the passions, the pathoi, rather than feeling them, which is just the most un-Jewish thing to me. Stoic Judaism, again, sort of seems a strange idea to me. Although if you do want to read an authentically Stoic Jewish text, Fourth Maccabees is clearly an example of a writer combining Stoicism and Judaism into one philosophy. It's kind of a grim book. It's about a guy being tortured, but it's a good opportunity for Stoicism. Philo also seems to go along with the Stoics in terms of saying that virtue is sufficient for eudaimonia, virtue is sufficient for happiness. Although what he does is, again, he splits the difference. He says there are two lives. There's a happy life. There's the eudaimon life. There is a life of eudaimonia, and it is, in fact, virtue is sufficient for it. But there's also the supremely happy life. There is a kind of hyper eudaimonia, and that most supreme life would include both virtue and the external goods. So yes, you can be eudaimon without the external goods, but if you have the external goods and virtue, you have eudaimonia. I like this image of the guy playing. Has a krater, and he's playing the game where you spin the krater on your finger and try to throw out the lees of the wine. And they had targets for like after dinner drinks where you would you would spin it around and try to like use the centrifugal force to throw the lees out of the bottom of your kylex, not a krater. Krater is a mixing bowl. The kylex here. And so using the kylex to throw the leaves out was a pretty popular game after symposia. So this is a good example of him maybe playing that game. I can only imagine the mess that the poor slaves had to clean up. And as I mentioned, right, Philo is a complete magpie when it comes to ethics, folks. I know I'm just ringing the same bell over and over and over again, but I cannot express to you just how much of a magpie he is. He likes the fact that in Numbers it says that the Torah will allow you not to veer too much to the left and too much to the right, and he reads that as clear endorsement of Aristotle's point in the Nick Ethics that virtue is a mean between two vices. Right, courage is obviously having a means that you would do nothing daring. Having too much courage, of course, means that you would just rush into doing everything foolish, recklessness, the vice of recklessness, and the vice of cowardice. In the mean, of course, is courage, a classic Aristotelian idea of the mean between two vices. So he just takes that line from Numbers and just squeezes Aristotle right into it. But he does accept the classic 4 Greek virtues: wisdom, justice, moderation, and courage, but he modifies them. He says that in addition to these, or perhaps even subbing out some of them, he says that we should actually consider the virtues to be justice, courage, philanthropy. And he doesn't mean philanthropy the way that we mean it, which means like wealthy people giving away money, which you would hope that he would mean it that way, considering he was incredibly wealthy. But philanthropy and good breeding, the idea of being of good stature. It's a very English kind of virtue. So he says that these are the 4 virtues that he elects for, and chief among them, ruling over them, is piety and holiness. And so this is very clearly a Judaic import. Holiness and piety, eusebia being the opposite of asebia, which was what Socrates was executed for. Eusebia, piety, is going to be of a crucially important virtue there. I can remind folks that in Hermeticism, eusebia is also the chief virtue. Reverence is how it gets translated in some ways, but reverence is the chief virtue in Hermeticism. It is interesting that Philo also crowns it next to holiness, which is a very Jewish kind of virtue, as the chief of the virtues. But here we have justice, courage, philanthropy, and good breeding. Philanthropy for Philo just means literally what it says, just to love your fellow man, love your fellow human being. You should read it very literally, not in the sense of giving money. All right, folks, so as we begin to wrap up, Philo seems to have influenced basically no one around him. We don't see anyone referencing Philo after him. So when we get to Plutarch next week, when we talk about Numenius, when we get to other kinds of people later in the Middle-Platonists, no one seems to know who he is. My sense of it is that he's not even publishing this stuff. Or if he's publishing it, he's publishing it in a very, very meager way. And maybe just for his friends who he's going to torture with this stuff. But he doesn't seem to be really putting this into the marketplace of ideas. And it could just be the case that other Greek philosophers viewed this as just so parochially Jewish that they didn't care. So this is always the kind of fate that this stuff suffers from. On the one hand, it's too Jewish for the pagans to care about. The pagans always had a very distant and cold relationship to Judaism in general. So on the one hand, the pagans don't care about this. On the other hand, the Jews don't care about this. The Jews are like, you're just incorporating a bunch of pagan philosophers and making the Torah do this pagan dance to make Stoicism and all this stuff work. And so I think traditional Jews would have looked at this and thought, no. And I think traditional pagans would have looked at this and gone, no. But wait, just give Philo a generation and guess what emerges? Jews and pagans mixed together become this newfangled thing called Christianity. And for Christianity, a Jewish originated religion, now speaking and thinking Greek Hellenistic thoughts, that is just the perfect thing. So Philo just sort of invented a hot commodity before he knew it was going to be a hot commodity. And it took Christianity to come along, look at Philo, and began like, yeah, this is what we want. And so Christianity is going to be the thing that saves Philo, because otherwise I think that he would have been abandoned. There's no evidence that Jews are reading him. Or at least Jews out of Alexandria are reading him. Certainly not establishment Jews in sort of Israel, Palestine, and that region, Judea. And there's no evidence that pagans are reading him either. But who does read him? The people who do eventually get hegemony over the ancient world. That is to say, Clement of Alexandria, people like Eusebius, people like Origen, they're going to copy him. And people like Eusebius make a very important mistake. They think that Philo is living slightly later in time than he really is. And as you probably know, in a very important book of Philo, or a book that may have saved the whole thing, is that Eusebius has the belief that when Philo is describing very pious Jews living a Cenobitic life, living a monastic life in Egypt over by Lake Mareotis, who does Eusebius think those people are? Monks. He thinks that they're Christian monks. So he thinks that Philo might be a Christian, maybe, or at least is describing Christians in incredibly glowing terms. And if you've ever had the chance to read on the contemplative life, or if you want to watch my episode on the Therapeutai, Philo says, are the best philosophers that have ever existed. They are the most pure, they're the most thoughtful, they're the most contemplative people. And Eusebius said, look how Philo praises us Christians. And Philo survives. Right? Philo survives in a way that he otherwise wouldn't. Jews, on the other hand, aren't going to deal with Philo until 1575. There is no evidence of any Jewish people writing anything about Philo until 1575, when Azariah de Rossi writes his book, Meor Einayim. And in that book, he criticizes Philo. He says, Philo makes all kinds of mistakes because he takes the Torah to be an allegory. He doesn't read it in Hebrew. He doesn't have the oral tradition. He makes all these mistakes. And this is the reason why Philo is to be dealt with at arm's length. And to this day, in the Orthodox world, Philo is simply not read. No one reads Philo. I think maybe most people hardly even heard of him. And again, we even know him through his Greek name. We don't know him as Yedidiah, right? The Greek name was Yedidiah HaKohen. Or Halevi. He was a Levite family. So no one calls him Yedidiah. They call him Philo. He has his Greek name, and he's known primarily as a Greek. The only person that seems to know him in antiquity is, surprise, Josephus, another Roman Jew. And he only knows Philo. He knows that Philo is a philosopher, but primarily he knows Philo through the embassy to Gaius, to Caligula. So when you say Gaius, it sounds a lot better than Caligula, but it's the same dude. Little boots. But at any rate, Josephus knows about Philo primarily. He knows him as learned, but he doesn't talk about what he knows, but primarily through his embassy to Gaius. So, did I do it? I did Philo on one foot. It's a mess, folks. It is a complicated, wonderful mess. And so, but it is the mess that survives. It is our best glimpse into the magpie buffet world of Middle-Platonism. And when I keep beating the drum of saying syncretism is the watchword, man, could you believe it with this? We've already been talking about syncretism between Stoicism, Platonism, Aristotelianism, Pythagoreanism, now Judaism for some reason. So it's just the most eclectic, most synthesizing, and the genius of the synthesizing, again, as much as it might be kind of torturous to read, there is a genius in it. And this allows, and I think it's in these synthetic moments, it's in this sort of like anti-dogmatism, this anti sort of doctrinarism that's going to allow for the growth of things like Gnosticism, like Hermeticism, like Christianity. And of course, of all the things that Philo bequeathed to history, it is going to be the Logos. If Antiochus of Ascalon liberated the Logos from Stoic dogmatism, it is Philo in his move to make the Logos the demiurge. We're going to latch onto that idea, and everybody is going to run with that idea. The Hermeticists are going to run with it. The Christians are going to run with it. The Stoics will have it, obviously. The Gnostics will take it on. This idea is just incredibly important. And Philo is the person who gives it over to history. So as much as he is a magpie, as much as he is a syncretizer, again, as much as this can be just sort of like very involved and very torturous to read, he has contributed decisively to the development of Western philosophy. And in this way, we need to study him as carefully as we can tolerate. If you want to go start reading some Philo, you can read all of Philo online with the exception of a couple of things I think have recently been translated out of Armenian. But if you want to go read Philo, the one book I would say to start with is On the Giants. This is where Philo gives his allegorical understanding of why God flooded the earth. You get all kinds of cool philosophical nuggets. You get great stuff about the Nephilim, because who doesn't love the Nephilim? You get all kinds of stuff. I will warn you that it is very misogynistic, because Philo is a bit of a misogynist, so just be prepared for that. But if you want to go read something, go read that, and then maybe go read On the Contemplative Life. Because On the Contemplative Life is, I think, the book primarily responsible for Philo's survival. And that's the book that Eusebius had that talks about the Therapeutai. So if you want a taste of his allegory, don't dive into the interpretations of Genesis because they're just too much. But if you want a taste of his allegorical method, then I would suggest you go read On the Giants. But next week, we turn to a person who's typically known as a historian. We are going to turn to again, typically known as a historian, we will turn to Plutarch. And it is Plutarch who's going to give us our most involved demonology. So demonology obviously going to be a very important part of Middle Platonism, but it is Plutarch who's going to give us one of the most sophisticated demonologies of the ancient world. So next time we will transition over to the demonological world of Plutarch.